Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to your flipped classroom. We're going to pick right where we left off in class talking about the growth of the scientific revolution, right? And we're mainly going to be focusing this flip on the growth of the scientific revolution outside of astronomy into mathematics and also into medicine, right? We'll be focusing a lot on that medicine aspect today, and also how the scientific revolution affected society, right? We're going to see the growth of certain fields. We're going to legitimize things more or less than others and stuff like that. Now, you've had a great day in class today, talking a lot about Rene Descartes, right? We spent a lot of time talking about Rene Descartes, the crisis of confidence, discourse on method, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. That is just a product of this idea of Cartesian dualism, right? This idea that the human mind and thought patterns exist outside of the physical realm, and that we have no way to prove that we do or don't exist except for the fact that you actually have thought, which means that you must exist, right? Now, I have thought, so I know I exist, but if I don't know that you have thought, then I don't know if you exist. So I could theoretically just be speaking in my room to absolutely no one and not even existing in and of myself. I'm not about to have a crisis right now, okay? Y'all don't want to see a grown man break down into tears right now, not knowing if anything else is real. Now, the thing about it, though, in general is I love talking about Descartes, I love talking about that other stuff, and then we also talked about this today a little bit as well. The growth of different scientific societies. We talked about the growth of the Paris Academy of Sciences, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and then also the Royal Society as well, that was established in England actually under the Stuart monarchy, right? Now, this very, very famous thing actually was originally chartered by Elizabeth. We're not going to get into that right now. Nullius in verba, right? Take nothing as fact, doubt everything, know the world, right? And they are going to advocate for the experimental method that had been growing during the scientific revolution, over top of the ideas of like alchemy and things like that, and y'all's little alchemy game that y'all used to play. Now, the thing about it that you need to understand is that alchemy was still very, very prevalent, right? Alchemy, the idea of being able to combine things and move matter and force things and make gold out of nothingness, was still literally running around. Astrology, still heavily used and things like that. The scientific method is not going to just blow the doors off of European society and make them look at everything that they have been living their entire lives by when it comes to magic, like Abear talked about today, and other different things like that, and religious zealism and things, and just be like, no, that's not real anymore. So it's going to be a slow progression, very slow progression, and science is going to mainly affect certain circles of academia, and it's also going to mainly affect the nobles, the higher echelon people, and then also maybe the absolutists, right? Now, the regular person, though, on the other hand, still believes in astrology, still believes in alchemy, and still believes that maybe if you work hard enough, you can turn lead into gold, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is we now get to pick up on a very, very good story that I love to talk about, that of none other than Sir Isaac Newton, right? Sir Isaac Newton. Actually knighted by the Queen, Queen Anne, the very last Stuart monarch. Fun fact. Now, the thing about it, though, also, that most people are like, Newton, Isaac Newton, are Fig Newtons named after him? No, they are not. They are named after the city of Newton, Massachusetts, and Newton, Massachusetts was named after Isaac Newton. So it's like 2 degrees of separation, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is that you have to understand about Isaac Newton is a lot of people are like, well, I know he did. There's this Apple thing. Calm down over there, okay? Calm down real quick. We're going to get to the Apple stuff here in a minute. Now, when we're talking about it, though, is you have to understand where he's coming into, right? So most of Isaac Newton's work was done in the 1680s, right? 1687 being a big year for him. But the thing about it is by 1640, when this guy comes along and he's becoming more like educated and things like that, he wasn't even alive yet, right? And by 1640, Galileo's ideas, Kepler's ideas, Brahe's data sets, and Copernicus's ideas were pretty much universally accepted, right? Everybody was like, yeah, they were right. There's the sun's here and the earth's going around it and stuff like that. What are you going to do, right? Galileo was still under house arrest by 1640, not quite dead yet, and it's very, very important that we understand this concept. So why is Isaac Newton so important? What about him is going to make him so special? Well, a lot of it has to do with his work in mathematics, right? And also his work in the Royal Society. He actually joined the Royal Society Royal Society and actually joined their scientific echelon right around the late 1660s. And the big thing about it is he is going to be the mathematician that develops the systems that actually make it so you can prove all of the ideas that came before him in a mathematical sense, right? So the other thing you need to understand about it too is like his work may have never been realized if it wasn't for a terrible book that actually came out before his book, right? This really funny little book called The History of Fishes actually almost bankrupted the Royal Society, and they actually had to end up financing someone else's work. And so they actually decided to finance the work of Newton and publish his book next, which would break the earth completely. Not even break the earth, but break the scientific world's brains so hard that he would eventually become the president of the Royal Society, right? Now, the thing about it that you need to understand is as a gigantic gigantic scientific mind, as a person who looked at the history of fishes as a terrible book and stuff like that, as a person who joined the Royal Society of Academics and the Royal Society of Science, was he someone that wasn't very Christian? Because here's something that you need to understand. Just because you're a scientist and just because you had the ideas that may have angered the church, Galileo talking to you, just because you had these different ideas doesn't mean that you weren't super religious. Actually, Isaac Newton was extremely religious, very, very aggressively religious, almost to the point of being a religious fundamentalist, right? He actually literally drew all of his beliefs from the Bible. He believed that Judgment Day was coming. He actually made a big point to sit down and try to see if he could guess when Judgment Day was going to be, and he actually guessed that Judgment Day was going to happen in 1665 and in 1666 due to the fact that it was 666 and the number was repeating. And he wasn't that far off when we really think about it, because the Plague of London happened in 1665 and then the Great Fire of London happened in 1666, and he actually thought that this was the next coming of Christ and that this was going to be the end of the world, right? Now, this mind is also going to be the same one that develops mathematical constants that will literally prove every single mathematical idea going forward for the next several hundred years, right? So it's very important that we understand that just because you're a scientist doesn't mean you're not super religious, right? And so that actually, also, he was an alchemist. Actually, for a long time, Isaac Newton actually also believed that alchemy was a very real thing, right? So the thing that you need to understand is, where are we going with all this, right? Why am I talking about the different things that happened to this guy? Why am I talking about this bad book that came out in 1686 and stuff like that? Because you need to understand Isaac Newton as a person. Another big thing that you need to understand about him as well is that he was a very deliberate mind, right? He would always just be thinking constantly and make these really, really aggressive assumptions about things and really run gung-ho with them, right? Now, it was these two tragedies that also were a part of his religious background that are going to greatly affect his progression as a thinker, right? Now, in 1665 and in 1666, he had to move out of London to avoid getting the plague and then also to avoid the Great Fire. And it was outside of London in the 1660s that he begins working on his seminal tome of mathematics, right? And in the 1660s, he started producing what he believed to be the constructs of a mathematical imperative, right? He actually sat there and tried to figure out two giant things. One, in 1666 and 65, when he is living on his family's farm, right? When he is living on his family's farm, he looks out through a window, according to his story, and he saw an apple fall off a tree, right? And while he was seeing this, it's where he actually then gained the concept and the idea of the universal constant force of gravity, right? And the gravitational force that actually holds all of the planets in perfect alignment, right? He then began to use telescopes and mathematical devices to study the moon and the orbits around the Earth, and he began to realize that objects that are much, much smaller, just like Galileo, are going to orbit those that are much larger. But the thing that he couldn't figure out was, how do I prove this, right? And a lot of people were like, I thought he got hit on the head with an apple, right? Well, he just used the example, the apple story. The apple story is probably not even real. He just used it to explain it to people that couldn't quite understand it, right? And in his Principia de Mathematica, this book that he actually worked on, he had to develop a certain type of mathematics to actually prove the universal constant and change over time of gravitational forces and things like that. And so what did he develop? Drum roll, please. Write it down. He had to develop this type of mathematics just to make this whole thing possible and just to prove his theories on gravitational force. It's none other than the thing y'all like more than anything else, calculus, right? He actually develops the mathematics of calculus to prove this very important construct of gravitational force and how the planets moved around the sun. So this guy, Isaac Newton, is the glue that really held everything together and proved all the ideas of scientific thinkers that came before him, right? He is going to receive a massive amount of praise for this work, and people are going to begin to be like, oh my god, this guy from England who's unmarried and apparently a huge turd, he was not very nice. Apparently Isaac Newton was really, really arrogant and super mean and used to make fun of one of the guys that he worked with and called him a hunchback all the time and stuff like that. But anyway, in the long run, never got married too, because apparently he just had no time for women whatsoever, and he wasn't really concerned with it whatsoever, but he was also super Christian and stuff like that. But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So going into it though, he develops calculus, he develops the gravitational force theories, and he actually got into a massive feud with this guy, right? This dude is not the hunchback guy I was talking about earlier. That was Robert Hooke. Robert Hooke actually apparently was really short. And if you ever heard the very famous quote by Isaac Newton, the only reason I have seen so far is because I've stood on the shoulders of giants, and the way that he's trying to make it sound is oh, I can only know so much because of the people that came before me. He was actually kind of doing it as a very, very slap in the face of this guy named Robert Hooke, which we'll talk about here in a second. because Robert Hooke apparently was short and had a hunchback. Now, the thing about it, though, in general, is he got into a massive feud with this guy right here, Gottfried Leibniz, right? Because Gottfried Leibniz apparently also invented calculus, not around Newton. They invented it at the same time in 2 different countries, right? Gottfried Leibniz being a very different personality than Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was a little bit more like Michelangelo, right? Very reserved, very morose, very into what he was doing, designed his own experiments, didn't want to work with other people and stuff like that. It was like, I'm developing calculus so I can prove gravitational force. Also, I'm developing calculus so I can bring in the ideas of Newton's laws of motion and inertia, right? So the ideas of being like, oh, an object will stay in motion until an outside force acts upon it. And it was during this Principia de Mathematica era that he developed those laws on motion and movement. Y'all know the other big ones, right? Every reaction has an equal but opposite reaction, right? Another premise that he used to prove using his calculus model. Well, Leibniz was actually a married man and was a big member of the court in Prussia and also in the Holy Roman Empire, and he developed this while at parties and stuff like that, because he wanted to use mathematics to demonstrate change over time. And a huge feud came in between the two of them, and what historians have figured out is that they actually invented it at the same time, just not being around each other whatsoever. And later on, Isaac Newton would go on to write a series of other books before having a mental breakdown and stuff like that. And for example, another big one was On Optics, right? On Optics is another really big one that Isaac Newton came up with. He realized that if you take a prism and white light and cast it through that prism, it will separate light into the different colors, right? Now, wrapping it all back around together, in his book on Optics, where he used to take this prism and separate the light, he was the one that figured out that the rainbow colors are literally Roy G. Biv, right? Red, orange, yellow, blue, indigo, violet, and green, right? Red, orange, yellow, blue, Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, right? He figured that out. Isaac Newton published it in his book called On Optics. Optics is spelled O-P-T-I-K-S. And he published that in 1706, right? About 20 years before he actually died. And funny enough, though, he never stopped being super religious, right? Actually, he got really, really upset with himself at one point. Isaac Newton got really upset because people were like, did you just take God out of the universe, and instead of God being the one that pushes the planets around, are you saying math and gravity is the thing doing it? And he was like, no. And because of the On Optics thing, and when he split the colors and stuff like that, the only colors he actually saw when he did this in his book on Optics was red, orange, yellow, green, blue, and violet. So why is indigo in there? So Isaac Newton added indigo because he didn't like the fact that there was 6 colors, because he thought 6 was an unholy number, right? So funny enough, there's only the 6. All right, so yeah, it's very, very funny that he never stopped being super religious, and he actually, to this day, is interned inside of a very beautiful church in a very beautiful place, in a very famous place. He is actually interred inside of Isaac Newton's tomb in Westminster Abbey. And he has a massive tomb dedicated to himself. And I think, Bear, shout out to you. I think you've seen this before, right? So this is his massive tomb that's actually inside of Westminster Abbey with the world above him, his Principia de Mathematica, with all of his calculus and all of his gravitational force ideas interred there with him, right? So going forward as well, though, that's all your Isaac Newton stuff, right? Isaac Newton, very, very famous figure. Very, very important. By the way, I'm going to drop the crash course video to the Scientific Revolution down in the description below, just to give you some other stuff to kind of hold on to and stuff like that. But yeah, so the big things to claim from Newton is his invention of calculus, gravitational theory, and his ideas on optics and the movement of light, right? But really quickly, we got Newton, Leibniz, who apparently invented calculus at the same time. We got Descartes, we got Galileo, we got Kepler, Brahe, Copernicus, all these different people that came along and dramatically shook the foundations of science, right? But how is that going to affect society, right? So on a societal level, how are the differences in astronomy and mathematics going to affect you as an everyday person? Well, the thing about it is, it didn't really that much, right? Because the growth of the scientific community is going to happen, right? Academics and academia is going to grow, rather than the way that it affected you on a personal day-to-day level, right? So when we're looking at this growth in ideas, the big thing about it is it's going to legitimize other fields rather than just theology, right? So it's actually legitimizing the study of mathematics, the study of science, and the study of many other fields of academia in universities that was becoming heavily prevalent, right? Also, the government is going to begin to be directly linked to and fund projects that are going to share outcomes with the state, right? What do I mean by that? Is your absolutists are going to start funding it, right? Look at this picture of Louis XIV right here, standing right next to his finance minister Jean-Baptiste Colbert, which Olivia brought up during one of our review sessions today and stuff like that during S period. The big thing about it, though, is when we're looking at the two of these guys, look at where Louis is sitting in the Paris Academy of Sciences, right? In front of navigational charts, a globe, in front of like these different ideas and like things that have been observed and ship models and stuff like that from where these different areas of scientific like to study are going. Taxidermy, the model of the universe right here using heliocentrism rather than geocentrism. What I mean by the government funding projects is I mean that absolutists are beginning to fund these scientists, right? Also, though, you would think as well, with the scientific community growing, does that mean we're allowing more women into academia? No. So, like, which is really screwed up. Even, did y'all know that Marie Curie, a woman that was so prevalent in the study of radiation and the movement of atomic particles that were dying and being irradiated, and all of her genius thought and theory that she actually applied to the Paris Academy of Sciences in the early 1900s and was told that she wasn't allowed to join it because she was a woman. So y'all, it's going to be a consistent thing that women will be barred from research and barred from scientific advancement and study for hundreds of years into the future, right? And also, like I said, there are limited effects on the regular everyday person, right? You saw some little things popping up, like this right here is the science of surveying and trying to figure out like flat planes and things like that, and also the uses of pendulums and if it works. And where this is actually taken was these are Dutch surveyors trying to figure out how to actually build canals more efficiently using mathematics. But that's about it, right? It would like affected people like on a workaday level. And also the debate between religion and science truly got kicked off during this time period, during the scientific revolution, where the church and scientific communities will begin to grapple with one another, right? But it's also important, too, to understand, people always ask, well, Mr. Terry, were the Protestants more accepting of science than the Catholics were? Actually, that's a really, really great question there, Mackenzie Clark. Not really, right? They were actually even more so kind of against it. The Protestants actually were more against scientific advancement than the Catholics ever were. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they were like, Protestants were very involved in reading the Bible on their own. So they were like, well, it doesn't say that here, so I don't believe it, right? So going into it, though, as well, you have to understand there's one other massive field that's going to be affected by the growth in scientific advancement, and it's that of medicine, right? Medicine, the body, and the growth of chemistry is going to be very important to our understanding of the scientific community, right? So going forward, let's start with medicine, right? Medicine and the body are two things we can link together. Chemistry and also some observational sciences are things we'll get into as we go. Now I'm going to be getting you some more words and stuff like that on the screen a little bit, right? So the very first thing you need to understand about medicine and the development of medicine is all of it hinged, first of all, you're going to have massive changes in the medical field much later than the other sciences, right? And also, the most of the medicine and medicinal theory hinged on the ideas of an ancient Greek philosopher by the name of Galen, right? Galen, Galen, was a Greek philosopher that actually believed in the ideas of imbalances in your body is what led you to being sick. Except here's the problem. He's kind of like our other natural philosophers. He's a lot like Aristotle. He's a lot like Archimedes. He's a lot like Ptolemy. He's using what basically he can logic his way around and figure out. And his ideas of imbalance were good, but he didn't know what was being imbalanced, right? And so he said that you are made up of four fluids, right? Galen, an ancient Greek philosopher that most of like medicine would be based off of for the next over 1,000 years, said you got four fluids in you. You got blood, phlegm, and phlegm is like, you know what I'm talking about? Like, you know, like phlegm and like, so yeah. Then you got black bile and yellow bile, right? You have these four fluids, and that if any of them is out of balance in your body, then that's what actually causes sickness, right? And that's why most of like your different like ideas of medicine during this time period was bloodletting, right? Oh, you got too much blood in you. Let's take some of that out. So looking at this as well, you have to understand that this is not going to be accurate, right? And bloodletting becomes a very big prevalent idea because of Galen. And that's actually why barber poles to this day are actually red and blue, because it's based off Galen's ideas of bloodletting and also the chemical imbalances. The red represents blood, the blue represents clean water, and these two things right here are the wash tins that you actually used to go and get your hair cut and also get bloodlet at the barbershop, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is it's not until the 1500s when a man named Andreas Vesalius shows up, right? Andreas, spelled Andreaus. You can, like, it'll probably autocorrect, you can look it up or something like that. But Vesalius is a very, very prominent, De Humani, a very, very prominent scientist and also borderline Renaissance thinker that actually came out during the 1500s, right? And he has a very famous book that he publishes, and it's called De Humani Corporis Fabrica, right? And it means on the structure of the human body or on the fabric of human beings, right? The thing about it you need to understand is Andreas Vesalius is going to shake the world by the legs and the foundation on what it means to be understanding of the human body, right? Because for centuries before him, it was illegal to do autopsies or actually cut open human bodies after they had already died, right? Andreas Vesalius says, bump that, and starts doing autopsies, and not only doing simple autopsies, but also doing complex ones, right? Where he would actually peel the skin off human bodies so he could see the way that muscles and structural ligaments were actually attached to everything else in the human form. And his book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, serves as the very first autopsy-driven medical science text that had ever been seen in Europe up to this point, right? And in 1543, the same year that De Rev comes out, he publishes his book as well, right? And it is replete with all of these crazy drawings inside of them, where he shows the structure of the human skeletal system, where he shows the veins of an entire form, and you can actually see him inside of it as well, right here, peeling veins out of an arm and looking over his work, right, in front of a cadaver that he has in front of him. And on the front title of the book, he's standing inside of a giant audience hall doing an autopsy, and all these people are watching. And his original book of De Humani Corporis Fabrica was actually published and bound in human skin. Fun fact, because he actually had a lot of it lying around. You know what I mean? Got a lot of book, like a lot of extra skin lying around. Get it tanned, make it leather, and you're good to go. And then he actually made his very first one out of human skin. And then there's another famous scientist that comes around about 40 years later after him, right? Well, was born 40 years later after him anyway, and his name was William Harvey, right? William Harvey wrote a book called De Mortu Cortis, which is actually all about vivisection, right? And how to actually analyze the body before it actually dies, right? So William Harvey takes Andreas Vesalius' idea of autopsy and then also understanding the movement of human forms. And also, well, the thing was, is William Harvey couldn't do this on people. He had to do this on animals to try and understand the circulatory system and the way that it worked, right? So William Harvey came along and was actually one of the doctors to James I and VI, right? Very prominent figure who begins his study of animal bodies, and he concludes and realizes and figures out that the heart and the circulatory system, all this extra blood and stuff, it's not coming out of your body because there's too much of it. It's coming out of your body because your heart is a pump, right? It is an actual thing that moves fluid throughout your body. And he figured this out by doing vivisections on animals, as in cutting them open when they're asleep or under sedation and actually watching the heart move before the animal actually died, right? And he concluded this and figured it out, that it actually, all these ideas of Galen are wrong, right? It's not extra blood, it's not extra bile, it's not extra things like that. It's more along the lines of you have bad pumps in your arteries, you have a bad heart, your circulatory system is out of whack. And he begins to advance these different ideas. And then he's fired, right? Like, he's like fired for his ideas and ends up having to take his like genius elsewhere. And it was after he was fired that Charles II, the king that brought back partying, ends up dying because he's tortured to death by his doctors who still believed in alchemy, and then like seared his ends shut, and then like also bloodlet him numerous times and stuff like that. You should just listen to William Harvey, man. That heart is a pump. It's just a pumping away, right? So now look, the big other thing about the medicine, the body, and also chemistry as well, is these different ideas are also going to lead to the concepts of studying things on a micro level, right? Speaking of, we've got these two guys that come to prominence named Hooke, Robert Hooke, and Leeuwenhoek. Yes, Robert Hooke, the same guy that Isaac Newton worked with and made fun of, is going to be very, very important. But Leeuwenhoek came first, right? Leeuwenhoek was a Dutch scientist that rather than making a telescope for the stars, he decides to make a telescope for microorganisms, right? And he develops the very first microscope ever seen in the late 1600s, right? Now, with that, you have to understand is that Leeuwenhoek's ideas are like, we now understand a universe of planets, stars, and things out there, right? But what we don't understand is there smaller little universes within a drop of water, right? And so what Leeuwenhoek does is he develops this microscope right here, which I know looks a heck of a lot more like a ping pong paddle than it does like a microscope. But the way it's structured is there's a small glass lens right here, and this is your specimen holder right here. And you actually look at it from the opposite side, right? And he began to take water from ponds, pond water and pond scum, and began to look at his look at his slides underneath this small little microscope, and he saw life. and he saw movement, and he saw things moving around, right? And it was with this idea that he begins to expand on the ideas that there is an entire world beyond the naked eye that we can't even see, right? And then Robert Hooke comes along, and he develops a more complex microscope that he actually uses to see things at even greater of a length of magnification, right? And Robert Hooke uses the idea of refractory lenses, much like in Galileo's telescope, but begins to apply it to the world of the tiny rather than the world of the grandiose outside of this planet. That's the best I've ever explained this, right? And the thing about Robert Hooke, and the reason why he's remembered a lot more than Leeuwenhoek Hooke, is because his microscope is a lot more like the modern one, right? And also because Robert Hooke was a phenomenal artist. And Robert Hooke used to take insects and other items, put it underneath his microscope, and since he was such a good artist, he could draw the things that he saw. This right here is actually a lice, right? It's a louse. It's like an actual lice parasite. And another famous one he's very well known for is the drawing of a flea, which is very, very cool. And if you get a second today, look it up. It's very, very neat looking, right? So the thing about it, though, is in general, is these two men, like Robert Hooke and Leeuwenhoek Hooke, come along, and they develop the microscope, right? Now, that right there is us wrapping up the scientific revolution, right? And as you know, the effects of this are going to grow, and you're going to see absolutists like fund it and all these other things. But now we're getting into none other than the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is probably just as important, if not more important, than the scientific revolution itself, right? The scientific revolution is really, really great because it's like an extension of Renaissance humanism, right? You got the ideas of what does this do? Why is this way? And then the creation of scientific theory and actual experimental methods to try and figure out those questions, right? So the scientific revolution is very important. You got people disproving Galen. You got the ideas that the blood is like moving through our bodies like a heart pump instead. You got Vesalius peeling skin off bodies and stuff like that. And I'm sorry, but the drawings from Andreas Vesalius' De Humani Corporis Fabrica, like some of those like ideas of like the autopsies and the skeleton like sitting like this and stuff like that. And if you look up any other ones, they're super, super cool. I could never get a tattoo because I'm afraid of needles, but if I ever did get one, I would really like one to be from the De Humani Corporis Fabrica sketches. They're very, very cool. But the thing about it, though, is the Enlightenment is a lot different. And just like Sophie Panzavecchia said in class the other day, we begin to take the ideas of the scientific revolution and apply it rather than to science. Let's use this experimental method to understand our government, right? So this thing right here, screenshot it. Do not write it unless you feel like you absolutely have to, right? But this is just a general timeline of the progression of European history from right around 1543 when Copernicus publishes De Rev, kind of going through the rest of European history, right? But just so you understand, De Rev was published around 1543. Same thing too, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, right? We got a lot of big movements coming out in 1543. The 30 Years' War starts in 1618. The English Civil War rages from 1642 to 1651. The Principia by Isaac Newton, where he comes up with the concepts of gravitational force and then also calculus, is in 1687. All of these things are going on in what you would call the scientific revolution. But all the movements that came after, when John Locke writes the Two Treatises on Government, which is in 1690, when Peter the Great has his grand embassy tour and tours the entirety of Western Europe and realizes that Russia is behind the game, that's in 1697, y'all. And then when Prussia crowns their first king, Wilhelm I is in 1713, and Louis XIV died in 1715. All that stuff is more a part of the era of the Enlightenment, right? So just so you understand, the scientific revolution is going to help lead to the Enlightenment, and both of these movements are happening in the background of none other than, none other than the absolutist era in general, right? And the Enlightenment is going to keep going forward, right? So the thing you need to understand about the Enlightenment is that it is the intellectual and cultural movement of the late 17th and early 18th century, right? It is going to take the ideas of the scientific revolution, the study of human nature, but just like Sophie Panzavecchia said in class, it's going to begin to analyze the government and try to ask questions about society that can't necessarily be answered using science, right? They want to use reason and rationalism to the scientific revolution's empirical thought process, right? Remember, our two big different thinking styles, right? Plato's rationalism is what inspired Renaissance humanism, and then Aristotle's empiricism will inspire the scientific revolution and later Renaissance humanists as well. And the scientific revolution is going to reveal that study of human nature, and the Enlightenment is all about progress. How do we better the lives of everyday people? What is the best form of government? How should we be doing this? Where do we go from here? And all of this is happening at the exact same time while the scientific revolution and the era of absolutism are all going down as well, right? Now, the Enlightenment, though, just to give you a heads up, it's a very good kind of synopsis of it in general. It's a broad term that some historians argue, like the Renaissance, spanned hundreds of years, over 100 years, right? You could argue that the Enlightenment started in like 1670 with Thomas Hobbes and the backlash of the English Civil War, and then didn't really stop until like 1789 when like the French Revolution begins, right? Like so, but the Enlightenment is majorly important because it's like it pushed a rock down a hill that would then later cause a landslide, right? The Enlightenment is a philosophical movement about the concept of a European society, how it should be ruled, natural rights of people, and where we're going from here, right? And you have to understand a lot of it is caused by the backlash of the 30 Years' War and the scientific revolution, right? The 30 Years' War kind of really showed us what the human being is capable of, right? Killing each other over different religions, destroying each other's economies over different faiths and concepts of a world that exists outside of this place. And then the scientific revolution comes along and begins to break everyone's perception on all these different ideas. So the Enlightenment is kind of born from this craziness, right? And some of our earliest Enlightenment thinkers include guys like this dude, Baruch Spinoza, right? Who wrote a book called On Ethics. Now, Spinoza is a really good place to start with the Enlightenment because he begins to break cultural norms, right? So the cultural norms that came before, like the 30 Years' War and even right after, was that regardless of what you believe, God is a very real thing. Regardless of the 30 Years' War and man killing each other in millions of numbers, it's still like, oh, religion still predominates societal views. Well, Spinoza, interestingly enough, was an immigrant to the Dutch Netherlands and was originally a part of the Jewish community. But he actually wrote a book where he argued that God is not an omnipotent being, that actually God and nature kind of work in tandem with each other, and it's more of a universal force, and that there's no such thing as good and evil, and that it really all kind of stems from the idea of perception, right? Because he argued, well, the Catholics during the 30 Years' War thought they were fighting on the side of good, but so did the Protestants. So is there any real good or evil out there? And he brings up these very radical ideas, right? He argued against the concepts of Descartes and things like that. And so he is going to be a good thinker to start off with because he's going to start really kind of changing people's perception on all these different ideas, right? These radical ideas going forward are going to help lead to the rise of skepticism and the reemergence of skepticism, the belief that nothing is known beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? And this is going to lead to the rebirth of ancient and medieval skeptic dialogue, people like Plato, Aristotle, Diogenes, the readings of Cicero, and that of Augustine as well. Now, when we're looking at these things, it's kind of like the Renaissance 2.0 in the philosophic mind, right? And we're going to pick right up here on this point. Want to see y'all in class soon, okay? Y'all have a good one.